All right. So what I'm kind of going to do tonight is take three different intro classes and kind of squish them into one to kind of get a big overview of period medicine. So, we cover the earliest known herbals that we have are, just a little before the, well, most of them are in first century and they go, clear to the end of our period. So we're looking at, at least 1600 years of sources. And various locations and times. So I'm going to kind of just do a quick overview of everything and kind of give people a starting point that if there's something particular that they want to be interested in and research more, that they can kind of find it. So so first, we have a person who is sick. And so the first thing we have to try and determine is what is wrong with this person or what is making them sick. And so something that was fairly common clear through our time period is humoral theory. And humoral theory basically means that we are made up of 4 different fluids. And a lot of people have heard about bleeding and leeches and using flames to bleed you. And that is a process that is based on humoral theory and the idea that you have too much blood. But that's the one we hear most about, but there's actually 3 other humors. So there's black bile, yellow bile, blood, and then phlegm. And so each of us has our own balance of of those 3 fluids. And if anything gets out of whack, anything gets unbalanced, then we get sick. And so modern historians believe that it might be due to if you take blood and leave it to sit overnight, sometimes it will separate into 4 layers. And so you'll have the black clot that forms at the bottom. You'll have a layer of red blood cells, a white puffy layer, and then yellow serum on top. And so the idea is that maybe someone saw some blood that had set and separated, and they believed that in our fluids were these 4 different fluids, not knowing that they're really all just blood. So each of us have our own makeup. And so if I change something, I change my food that I eat, I change the clothes that I wear, even if I change my social status and start living a different life than the one I was previously, that can upset my humoral balance. And so my job as an apothecary, helping with a physician, would be determine, okay, so what is out of balance? And once we figure that out, how do we treat that? And they believe that any of the herbs that we eat, as well as the foods that we eat, can change those balances back or make them worse. And so you have to pick the correct food for a person and the correct medicines to help bring that back into balance. And there's a lot more about humoral theory, but that's kind of a base, so we know, this is how in period they believed people got sick. They all, they didn't know about bacteria, they didn't know about viruses. They believed sometimes that bad air would get into your system, and thus that would upset your balance. Any questions about humoral theory from anyone? No? All right.
Question.
Oh, we got a question. Do we?
Yes.
Okay, what is it?
My question is, would leeches be an effective way of treating COVID-19?
No, they would not be. There's no research to say that a decreased amount of blood would help your COVID-19, nor that leeches in any way filter out your blood and filter out viruses. So no, it really wouldn't. So any other questions about humoral theory? All right. So now we know kind of what caused it. How do we fix it, right? So herbs are assigned two different qualities. They can be wetness and heat. So if you have an herb that is moist and warm, that is going to increase your blood. If you have an herb that is warm and dry, that is going to increase your yellow bile. If you have an herb that is dry and cold, that's going to increase your black bile. And if you have an herb that is cold and moist, it's going to increase your phlegm. So what you would want to do is, if I have too much blood, I know that I don't want to eat anything that is moist and warm. I'm going to want things that are dry and cold. Or if I have too much phlegm, so I have way too much cold and way too much moist, I'm going to want something that's warm and dry. So for instance, ginger is considered to be warm and dry. And so thus, I would want to make a medicine that has ginger in it to help balance myself. Another way that we could try and determine what herbs I should use is a process called doctrine of signatures. And the idea is that God tells us what herbs should be used on different parts of the body based on the way he's made that thing to look. And so some examples that were believed to help us are walnuts, because they look like little brains. So if you're treating something to do with the brain, you would then use a walnut. Autumn crocus, the bulb on the root kind of looks like a gnarled toe. And so if you have gout or your toes are swollen, you would use crocus. Eyebright, which is like a little daisy kind of thing. It looks kind of like a little eye. We would use that on our eyes. Liverwort has the shape of a liver on its leaves, so we would use it on our liver. And that process, maidenhair is a fern, which actually is genus is Adiantum. So the barony of Adiantum is actually named after a fern, and that was used to treat hair loss. So all of these herbs were believed to be used on the type of body shape that it looked like. And so we can use those as well as humoral theory to figure out what treatments we want. So another way we can determine what's wrong is with uroscopy, which is a super fun thing. And the idea is that our body is urinating out various things, and we can tell from the urine what is wrong with a person. And so they actually in period used uroscopy vials, and you can actually look up, if you just Google uroscopy wheel, there actually are manuscripts in period where they had a bunch of these all in a circle, and they're all different colors, and then they tell you what that each means. And you can also look up physician uroscopy or something like that. And there are a bunch of different manuscripts that show a physician doing this, kind of looking up at it and have the window slightly open so the light's coming through. And so based on if we have particulates in there, if it's kind of milky, what color the urine is, whether there are chunks in there from like kidney stones or something like that, or if it tasted sweet, we know, right? Yeah, you would know that's what is wrong with the patient. So there actually are a bunch of different colors your urine can come in. Pretty exciting. Your urine can actually be in green. It can be blue based on different bacteria that you have. If it tastes sweet, then you know they have what was sugar sickness, which we now know is diabetes. And then there are also other bacterias and urinary tract infections that can change the color of your urine and thus give you fevers. And since they didn't really have super great treatments for, a lot of the time those kind of things were examples of or kind of signs that someone was actually going to die. So a lot of the uroscopy stuff actually says, unless the fever breaks, your patient is going to die. But they're still pretty interesting to look at, kind of a fun topic, and who doesn't love urine? I mean, so the next thing is called the Zodiac Man. And a little bit later in period, it became a little more common in Western Europe. It was mentioned clear back as far as the 1st century, but astrological effects on your body really weren't super common until late period in Western Europe. So the idea was that each of parts of our body is also affected by the sun, the stars, and the celestial bodies. And then those celestial bodies also oversee various plants. And so if I was to treat a injury to your head, I would want a plant that is ruled over by Aries, because Aries oversees your head, your face, your brain, and your eyes. And so you would then also, if you knew what was causing the problem, sometimes those are also thought to be ruled over by celestial bodies, and you'd want one that's opposite that. So for instance, I'm a Leo, and I know that Aquarius is the exact opposite of me. So if my issue is in my heart, my chest, my spine, that is ruled over by Leo, and I want a herb that is ruled over by Aquarius. So, and in fact, late in our period, especially in very Western Europe, it became actually illegal for a physician to treat a patient without first doing a star chart and determining where the celestial bodies are, and thus what treatment to use. And so there's actually some really cool late period almanacs that physicians used that had star charts for the year that they were working. And so you had to check those and make sure that you weren't going to do harm to your patient because you didn't know the way the stars were set up when you were helping the patient. So it's kind of interesting and kind of fun. You know, I mean, we think of astrology as mostly that thing in the newspaper each day that comes out, and or the email you get from the website that tells you what your astrology for the day. But in period, they actually thought it really kind of affected your body, and it affected your illnesses. All right, so I'll just run through them real quick. So Aries is your head, your face, your brain, and your eyes. Taurus is your throat, neck, and your vocal tract there. Gemini gets the arms and the lungs and the shoulders and the hands. Cancer gets your chest, breast, and stomach. Leo gets the heart, chest, and spine. Virgo gets the digestive system, intestines, and spleen. The Libra gets the kidneys, the skin, and the buttocks. The Scorpio gets the reproductive system, the bowels, and the excretions of your system. Sagittarians get the hips, the thighs, and the liver. And Capricorn gets your knees, your joints, and your bones. Aquarius gets the ankles and the circulatory system. And then Pisces gets the feet and the toes and your lymph nodes. So those are the various parts of your body ruled by the different zodiacs. So next, I want to kind of talk a little bit about some sources. And so one of my big passions is actually herbals. I love the medical texts and that kind of stuff. So to start, in the 1st century, a dude named Dioscorides wrote a book called De Materia Medica. And it actually became kind of the grandfather to all herbals in Western Europe. Pretty much every single one references this book. And it is, got some pretty cool pictures. The earliest extant copy we have is from the 4th century. It is in the Austrian Vienna museum there. It was given to an Austrian queen in the 4th century, and we have some that came after that, but that is our earliest one. It has some pretty cool pictures in it. It is separated into 5 books, and it is super expensive if you want a hard copy. But if you Google De Materia Medica PDF free. There's a website called Cancer Links, LYNX, and it actually has a free PDF version of it that you can download each of the books. So it's a pretty awesome free way to get a lot of information and kind of the basis of our herbals clear through our period. The first book is all aromatics. Got a lot of resins and herbs that kind of smell good, fruit trees and stuff like that. Then there's roots, and there's one that's got animals and rocks, and then it's got some that just kind of whatever is left that they didn't get in the first 5 books. So it was written about 79 AD. He was a Roman physician who traveled. And so he was actually able to travel all over the area and kind of research and compile the uses of herbs at the time. So it's a pretty good idea of, what medicine was like that early. And like I said, it's referenced clear through our period. And in fact, there are even medical texts in the 1800s to the early 1900s that still referenced his treatments. So it's a pretty awesome herbal, and affects a lot of what we have researched. Secondly, about the same time, Pliny the Elder wrote a series of books called A Natural History. And it is actually made up of, it's got like 100 books or something in it. And just a few books in the center of the series are about plants. But overall, it is a really good idea and glimpse into what Roman life was like. It was published just a little bit after Dioscorides, and he's a fairly famous guy. If you've ever seen the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, there is a picture of a guy on the beach, and the story is either he was like, hey, that's really cool, this volcano's erupting, I want to go study it, and went out on a boat to get closer to it. Or the other story is he was trying to be a hero and save someone. But he ended up inhaling a bunch of smoke and died on the beach. There is this one. This one is a little series, and it has 3 or 4 books in each one, and so you can actually find the books that you're interested in. There's also one on Kindle if you have Amazon, which has all of it, and it's super easy to search with. So, but this one's kind of neat in that this is actually one passage on each side. One's in English, one's in Latin. So it's kind of cool. You can look it up and see what the original Latin was, and what the translation is. Next, we're going to move into kind of the center of our time period, and talk about 3 really neat herbals that are kind of special. The first one is Hildegard von Bingen. She is a really awesome lady, right? And she is the first woman to write a medical text within our period. She is, or an herbal specifically. She was an abbess, and she ran a convent, and she actually became well known for giving advice to kings and popes all over Europe. There were times where she was told she couldn't do something, and she would actually go into a sickness and almost die, and they would be like, okay, I guess you can do it. And then she'd be fine, and she could go do it. So she did that quite a few times, ended up running her own abbey. And so she wrote a bunch of music, a bunch of visions and conversations with deities, the devil or whatever. But she wrote one herbal, and it contains a section on plants. It contains a section on stones. It contains a section on fish, and a section on birds, other animals, reptiles, metals. So it's actually a pretty neat book. You can easily find it on Amazon. And it's a really good kind of look at 13th century medicine. We have a bunch of herbals early, and then we have a kind of a dead area, and then they kind of start picking up in like the 13th and 14th century. And it's a good example of very common within our period. If I was in Germany, I would go through De Materia Medica and pull out the herbs that were natural to my area and make my own herbal and focus it down to things that I could easily get so that I could help people within my area find treatments a lot easier than having to dig through this big tome of, thousands and thousands of plants, which half of them don't grow here because they're Mediterranean. So this is a kind of a cool example of things that they did in our period where they kind of researched and found things specific to your region. So that's a cool herbal. I highly recommend it. The next one is the Tectonum Santatus, which is the medieval health handbook, and it is very focused on the humors. And so it covers not only plants and food, but activities, the winds, and clothes, and so and how those would affect your humors. It is also super pretty. Has some really wonderful images of people doing things with various fruits, animals, and it's a pretty great book. Has a little description of this one in particular. Couple guys, and it's all about south wind and how the south wind affects your ailments. Different clothes. So this one, these are wool and linen, and so how those will affect your illnesses. And it gives nature of your item, and so it tells whether it is cold or dry or warm or cool. It tells the best way that it is to be used. It tells the dangers of it, so what it will affect negatively. And then it also tells you how to counteract that badness. So if something is going to cause problem to your stomach, it will tell you to do this to counteract that. So it's kind of neat. It's a fun one to look at. Lots of pretty pictures. It's kind of a neat herbal in that it was, there's 4 of them all across Europe that were all found, written about the same time. And they have different combinations of plants in them. They think they might have been written by the same person. And so they've actually kind of compiled them, but it's kind of interesting that they're in 4 different places. It's Milan, Paris, somewhere in Germany. And so they're just all over Europe, but they look like they might have been written by the same person. So the Tectonum Santatus, or you can just look for the Medieval Health Handbook and it'll come up. There's a bunch of different versions of it. This one's a hardback one. I highly recommend this one because it actually has, in the back, it actually references which of the items is in which book, which is kind of cool. The final mid-time period herbal that I want to talk about is the Physicians Medify, which is a Welsh one. And it's kind of interesting because it was written in Welsh. Up until then, almost all the medical texts were written in Latin. So this one was interesting in that it was written in the home language from where it was from. It also is not written in, this is the plant and this is what it's used for. It's written in, this is what is wrong with you and this is how you treat it. So it lists just a bunch of different ailments and then how to treat them. So it's kind of cool and a lot easier if you are looking for a particular treatment for a particular ailment. A lot of the herbals don't have indexes. So you kind of just have to, dig through and search. So this is kind of cool because the title of it told you what you were going to be using it for. Because not very often do we say, oh, I have this plant, let's see who I can treat with it, right? Like I have an illness and I want to know how to treat it. So So that's another cool one. It's translated into English. It was translated in the 1800s, and then Terry Beverton retranslated it. And what's kind of neat is he references the original translation and what he thinks was wrong with it. So it's kind of cool if you're really, digging in and looking, you can kind of see, okay, yeah, I can see where, and he explains why I think this is the way it is. So it's a really good book to start with. It's particularly good if you are Welsh. And it's a fun one to just sit and read. Like, there's just some really weird treatments. Like, like hemorrhoids, actually, is one of the ones that really struck out at me when I was reading it the first time, which involves using a red hot poker after you cut it out with cold iron and then smearing honey all over it. So, which just sounds terrible. So, but it's got a lot of really neat treatments. Any questions about our mid-period herbals? Did I see a hand up? Yes.
Yeah. You said humorous a few times, and I'm thinking you're talking about a funny bone, but maybe not.
No, I'm talking about the 4 fluids that our body is made up of.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
That they believed were, yeah. So those 4 fluids are your humors. So those are the 4 that if they're out of balance, that's when we get sick. Then our late period, which specifically are English because I'm English. So this one is Gerard's. I love it a lot. It was written in 1597, the first edition. This one is the second edition, which is 1611. But if you Google, always with the Googling, if you Google Gerard's free PDF, there actually is a scanned copy of the original that you can go through. It's super hard to read because it is in the typeface of the time, but it is still super cool. So Gerard was super popular within our period. Some historians don't like him. They think he's just a copycat. There are some herbals, right, from the period that he might have just took the entire passage and put it in his book. But there were plagiarism laws. So what's super neat is most of the passages have really cool woodcuts. And so if you don't know, most of the illustrations in period are 2 types. So these are the woodcuts, and they are made by basically carving on wood the outline of a plant and then using it like a stamp, right? The other one would be hand done painting, right? So later in period, when they started printing, they were using woodcuts. And so he has just a ton of woodcuts in there. Some of the plants that he references, he'll have like 6, 7 different species of that plant and a woodcut for each one. So it's kind of neat to be able to look and see what the plants look like. Because sometimes the ones that are hand painted, you have a monk somewhere who is translating it, who is painting it from a painting, which they painted it from a painting, and that person wasn't a very good artist. Like, there are some herbals where they've released them and they don't know what they say, and you can't tell what from the picture that is. Like, okay, it's a plant, but what? So it's kind of neat. Really detailed pictures. You can see whether there's bulbs or roots or what, and then what the shapes of the flowers were, and kind of how the overall structure of the plants are. What's kind of neat about Gerard is he is some of our first references to New World plants. And so what he was super interested in was finding the plants that were brought from the New World and planting them in his garden and then researching them. So anything in his book pretty much that covers New World plants are from his own research. And so do any of the plants look like Mary Jane leaves? Actually, it's totally a period herb. and there are completely references to Mary Jane in herbals, and talks about smoking them. So I mean, it's totally period. He also has potatoes, which is pretty neat. So potatoes are technically period. A lot of people say they're not. They are just very, very late period. He has actually a reference to a tomato. He calls them apples of love. And there actually is a sauce that you cook down the tomatoes, add vinegar and spices to it, and you can use it on steak. So it's basically Tudor ketchup. I know, right? So it's kind of neat. It's great references for New World plants and just kind of how, England saw plants as a whole. It talks about where a lot of plants come from, and talks about, and sometimes, how things are grown and where they're grown at. So it's a pretty awesome herbal. He was he was Elizabeth I was a benefactor of his, so he was kind of paid by the crown to research plants. So I highly recommend. There are some smaller versions of it, edited down ones that you can get fairly cheap. This big one was like $125. But you can usually find a cheaper version than the big one, as well as the free PDF version. So the next one is William Turner. It's a new herbal, and it is kind of interesting in that he had a terrible time. He was thrown out of England over and over, and he was just, his books would get burned, he'd be thrown out, and then he'd come back and start his research again, and it would happen again. What's kind of neat about his herbal is it is one of the very first English specific herbals. So it came out, when was his? 1550. Before that, England didn't really have any herbals that were English. They had herbals that they had translated from other places. So this is the first, actually written by an Englishman in England. Also some super cool woodcuts, and overall a pretty awesome book. He also has, what was kind of neat is his third edition of the book actually has a list of plants and what they're called in different countries. So if you are looking at various sources, you can kind of use it to say, oh, this plant means this in this language. And so it's a kind of a cool source. So that is William Turner, and it's called A New Herbal. The final late period one is Culpeper's, which is actually written in the 1650s. So it's technically out of our period. But I like to include it because it is a really easy herbal to get a hold of, and it is mostly based off of period texts. So if you are interested in late period stuff and you want a fairly cheap beginning herbal, Culpeper's is the one to get, I think. He got fairly good descriptions of the plants. He talks about where they're grown, when they flower, and then what their uses are. He talks about their virtues, how they fit with the humors, as well as what celestial body oversees them. So it's a pretty good starting herbal, as long as you realize that it's technically just out of our period, but it's a good starting point to kind of move backwards from. Any other questions or comments on our late period herbals?
I threw a comment on there. Just because that was written in 1650s, sounds like most of the information was actually well within period.
Right. And so that's why I include it, because even though it's technically written outside our period, most of the information within it is from our period.
I had some questions in the chat.
Oh yeah, okay.
You mentioned potatoes was in one of the books. Do they have a medicinal use?
I don't remember. see if I can find it real quick. What's also really neat, while I'm looking to just, so often we know when someone mentions potato, we think sweet potato, because we know that it's period, but he actually lists sweet potatoes. So we know that is not what he is talking about. And he actually has the first drawing of a potato. His does have an index, which is fantastic. Potatoes, Virginian potatoes. So we have the potatoes of Virginia. Oh. So let's see if I can get that picture up there. There we go. So that's our first period woodcut of a potato. Super neat. So let's see. The temperature and virtues be referred to unto common potatoes, being likewise a food and also a meat for pleasure, equal in goodness and wholesomeness unto the same, being either roasted in the embers or boiled or eaten with olive oil, vinegar, pepper, or dressed in any other way by the handsome cunning of cookery. It is said that the roots are forbidden in Burgundy, where they call them Indian artichokes, and that they caused leprosy. So he references that they could be used the same as potatoes, which we know of as sweet potatoes. So, so they're wholesome. They're so if you cook them in the embers, they lose some of their windiness, which means they give you gas less if you cook them in the embers. And they are good and wholesome for nutrition. They are hot and dry and give you strength and have a comforting nature. So basically, they're good for you if you are phlegmy. So if you're cold and moist, you would want to eat potatoes, either potatoes or Virginian potatoes, and they're good just to strengthen like a sick person. So kind of like like a soup, or you broil them and they will help strengthen a person who is ill, as long as their humoral balance is out of balance and needs something that's hot and dry. That answer the question?
Yep.
All right. Is there any other questions?
What is, and I may be mispronouncing this, copperas?
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 So that is a type of copper salt. So it's like a verdigris. So verdigris comes in a couple different colors depending on the oxidation process. And the ones they're in period, generally one was considered verdigris, the other was copperas. And I can't remember which way it goes, but depending on if you're using an acid or a base to affect your copper, one will be green and one will be blue. So I think the blue, which is caused by an acid, but I'd have to look it up more. So it's a salt made by the vapors of an acid or a base adhering to the metal on copper, and you scrape off the bits. So kind of very similar to verdigris.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Any other questions? Okay.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So it sounds like we're talking more about like scholarly medicine. Is there any crossover with like the folk medicine, like you'd find the midwives doing?
So there is, so most of our sources will be scholarly, but a lot of them will reference when, for instance, Hildegard, Hildegard went and asked the people what they were using. So a lot of the scholarly references the folk medicine. There's not a lot of sources that I have found yet that focus mostly on the folk medicines. There is some like Anglo-Saxon herbals, Bald's Leech book and the La Cubna, which both of those are very folk medicine-y and that way. But most of the sources that we still have are kind of more scholarly, or will reference what the people or will do. So, but there's not a lot of sources that are actually focused more on just folk medicines.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the last bit, I just kind of want to go over some tools that were used in period. So we already talked about the uroscopy vial. So this was used to look at someone's urine. They're usually very round bottom, and they very often you would want clear glass, because you want to look at the color of the urine. The next tool that's fairly common is a mortar and pestle. The mortar, the pestle, they come in various different, made out of various different things. This one is metal. It actually was, this one is a antique, it was dug up from, they're estimating like the 1800s. But there are some that were made out of brass. There are stone ones. There are Roman ones. If I have one. You must have packed it for a display and never put it back. Anyways, they're flat, and they're made out of clay and fired, and they have little granular bits of clay that are stuck on the top. And so that gives your real rough surface. There are some that are shaped like this, made out of clay for real fine grinding. And then there are wood ones and marble ones, any kind of stone or anything like that. And then depending on what you're grinding, if you're grinding something super hard, of course you're going to want a metal one. And the least porous your mortar and pestle is, the less bits of your stuff is going to get left behind when you move on to your next thing. So I have a pretty nice brass one that actually looks like the Tudor era ones. That's the one I use the most because the metal's not porous, it doesn't leave behind bits. But you can easily find marble ones. There's even some like pretty cheap onyx ones. And those are both really good starter mortar and pestles. The fun thing is that I, as the master apothecary, would not be doing my grinding. I would have an apprentice. And it's just kind of something you got to play with, and you'll end up getting stuff everywhere as you're bashing into that mortar with your pestle. They will fly out, so you got to learn how to grind and not get it everywhere. So definitely recommend practicing and be prepared to have a little bit of a mess. Our next tool are scales. So this is a antique scale set, and comes with little weights. This would be pretty much mostly useful if you're going to be studying late period medicine. Early period didn't really have weights. They didn't use drams and scruples and such like that. It was as much as you need, as much as you've learned should be used, a handful. So early period, very guess-like. You just kind of figure out how much you're going to use through trial and error, right? Or they'll do proportions. So twice as much of this as you use of it. So those are kind of fairly common measurements. Late period, they get into drams and scruples and things like that. Then we would need something to store our ground herbs in. And so apothecary jars are super common late period. They are used from about the middle to the end of period. This one is theriac, and it has my theriac in it, which, side note, is a pretty neat thing. If you're interested in poisons and antidotes, this is something you should definitely look into. It is made of, this one was made of 28 different ingredients, including a bunch of different plants, as well as beaver gland. And then it is all mixed with honey and ages. So, and it was super expensive. So I did a half batch and I spent about $500 on it. And I actually researched how much a treatment would cost. And the average person would have to spend weeks of their pay to get a treatment of theriac in period. So it was mostly for rich people. But because it was so expensive and a staple, it would have the name on it. Other apothecary jars, which are fairly common, you can see like this one. There's no name on it. This one is from the 13th century. Well, it is painted like the one from the 13th century. And it would have a top on the top, and you would have a label so that it could be used for various things. So if you had something very specific and something very expensive, you would have your apothecary jar labeled. But most of them were not labeled, so you could use them for whatever you wanted. Here's another one, 13th century. This one was Middle Eastern. So another fairly common way, so there are different ways that you can get a drug or herb into someone. So you can make it like a tea. You can mix it in with the wine or vinegar and have them drink it. You can make a poultice and rub it on. You can make it into a wash and then flush out a wound. Or you can make a pill for them. And so in period, they would use tiles like this to roll the herb and honey or whatever thing you're using to gum arabic or something like that to make it into a little pill that the person could then swallow after it dried. So a pill tile, pretty common tool. And then late period, they had syringes. And syringes were not used like we think today to inject. They were used for wound care. And so they would stick the end in the wound and then flush it out with an herbal solution. This one is out of our period, but looks very similar to the one that's on the Mary Rose, which is mid-1500s. So those are some more common tools that were used for medieval medicine. Any questions? No? All right. So that's actually pretty much what I've got. So we can just general questions and talk about it. Talk about medicine. Any?
Has any of your reach extended to Eastern medicine?
So I have very little in Eastern medicine. I have some electronic copies of some Chinese ones, but most of my research is in Western European. I've started moving kind of like to the Middle East area.
My interest is primarily coming from the direction of scribal, because Chinese medicines were often used as an ingredient in ink sticks.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have one or two electronic Chinese ones, but I've never actually like read through them. I just kind of randomly will find them and I'll throw them into a folder to get to later. But so sadly, no, I haven't really researched it much.
So something kind of along those same lines. I'm would like to try to find period henna recipes. And henna has been used for medicinal purposes, and I kind of like to see what all they've done with that. But I have no idea where to get started with that.
So definitely, I would think that a good starting place would be period medical texts. I'm just looking real quick to see if. So I will keep an eye out actually for any medical texts from that region and see if I can. I'll send them your way if I.
That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Could you send me your Chinese ones?
Yeah. I will. Do you find me on Facebook? Send me a message. I will send you a link to it. I am tagged in the notices for this, so I should be easy to find.
I think we're already friended.
Okay. All right. I'm a little bad. I have a lot of Facebook friends, and so
No, it's
sometimes.
okay. My Facebook name is completely mundane, so.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that doesn't help. I'm terrible with names. Any other questions?
So I guess I got one about your techniques.
Yeah.
So more high level on your research, where do you know to get started for finding these sources? Like you found sources all the way back to the first period, which I don't even know how you've pulled that off. There's just so, you mentioned Google, and Google Fool only gets you so far, but how do you weed out what's actually viable and what's just random information?
So let me grab a book real quick. Or three books. So, a good place to start. I really like this book. It's called An Illustration History of Herbals. And what it does is goes through. So, like, this is the passage on De Materia Medica. And it talks about, what the herbal is and what's special about it, when it was written, and it gives you what we know as far as when it was published, what extant versions of it are, and if there's any modern English references to it. So there are lots of books like this. There's the History of Herbals. This one is just called Herbals. This one is called Herbs, A Global History. And so these secondary sources are a good spot to find what extant texts there are. So it's a good place to kind of go, I want to look for De Materia Medica. And so that gives you a really good point to go back to. The other thing I would recommend is the British Library has a search option, and you can actually look by topic. And so you can put in herbals or medicine, and it'll actually give you all of the extant copies of the herbals that they have, as well as you can sort it by time period. So some of mine are, I have an electronic folder of herbals, and so I find one on there, and it's from the 1400s, and it's a commonplace book. I can throw it in there. So secondary sources that talk about herbals and the history of herbals are a good place to find them, as well as the British Library and other big institutional libraries like that have electronic copies of the original extant sources.
Okay.
Also, I can actually put together a list. I'll post it in the Terraformaria group of a bunch of period herbals, their names, who wrote them, and their time. and most of them will have, I think I even have some that have links to where you can find them. So I can post that.
Fabulous.
Awesome.
Chasing down the sources. Good old fashioned. I like it.
Yep. Yep. Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right.
Okay, gang. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I think we will let Viscount Seamus get on with his evening, and
Or you can stay and socialize.
or you can stay and socialize. Yeah,
I
no
will-
problem with that either.
Hang out with the cool kids.
I'll make sure and post some links to things that people can continue to their research with. So
Okay, and we are also planning. We will be rewatching the video for editing purposes, and we'll stack some of the links, hopefully in the doobly-doo down at the bottom of the videos.
awesome.
So when those get posted, we should have. But I would just like to say thank you again for
That's not.
oh wow sorry, my daughter's making slime. Speaking of strange things that one does with.
Hey, no judgment.
It was a truly fantastic glass.
Yeah.
I'm very glad.
I'm glad.
But
Yeah,
is
there's
it
a lot of
period
great
slime?
resources. What is slime?
Period slime? Is it period slime? I think was
It
the
is-
question.
No.
It is not period slime. I think period. Well, I don't know if period slime would stain less or more.
Would it be in the cold and moist?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if you have too much blood, you should use some slime.
Excellent. Okay, we will keep that in mind. Oh goodness. But yes, we appreciate you taking your time to
Yes,
present
very
this
much.
class
For
for us.
having me.
And yeah,